To start the afternoon session, we have another incredible keynote speaker, this time Bhiamie Williamson, a Euahlayi man from northwest New South Wales, from Gaduga. Bhiamie is very proud to be leading the National Indigenous Disaster Resilience Program. He is a geographer. He has studied and worked with Indigenous communities throughout Australia and Canada and the United States. He has a history working, advising and researching in the disaster resilience sector with a focus on the impacts of disasters on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Please join me in welcoming Bhiamie to the stage.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and it's wonderful to be here with you all. My name is Bhiamie Williamson. I'm Euahlayi. My people come from northwest New South Wales, and that's where I'm lucky enough to live out home in our little Aboriginal community of Gaduga. My mother's from Cloncurry, up in northwest Queensland, and her family go up into the Gulf Country, and the Queensland side. I'm absolutely delighted to present this keynote exploring Aboriginal people and cultural capitals, enhancing disaster resilience. Before I go on, as is our way, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country upon which we're gathering here today. I'd like to acknowledge, the Bundjalung people. I honour their elders, I honour their ancestors, and I honour the creator of this country. I'd also like to acknowledge our wonderful friends at Resilient Lismore. Congratulations on organising this wonderful event, and just it's so wonderful to be in a space here in Lismore, to be in a friendly space for us all to come together 2 years after the catastrophic floods in 2022. To reflect on those events whilst also firmly looking towards the future. I'm very happy to have been invited here to talk as someone with a little bit of knowledge on disasters, emergencies, recovery and Indigenous people specifically. But knowing your struggles and your courage, I feel small in your company. So congratulations, and you should be very, very proud of yourselves and your efforts. Look, I've met many of you. And some of you know little bits of what I do. It was kind of hard when as Kate said in her keynote this morning, the brief was just come and give a talk. And it's like, what do you want us to talk about? Talk about your work. And I'm like, that's, okay, I'm happy to do that, but that's, where do we start? So this session's kind of pieced together from various talks, various discussions, various presentations that I've done over the previous year. So it's a little bit of storytelling. It's a little bit of reporting on research. It's a little bit of advocacy, because they're all the kind of things that we do in our work. So if it feels like a roller coaster at times, it's because it probably is. Before I go further, our artwork has been done by a young Anangu artist called Umala Mackenzie. He's an Aboriginal digital artist. So if you're really interested and you like the stuff, we always like to showcase the talent of our community members, and he's a very, very talented young man. So I'm here today as a staff member of Fire to Flourish. Fire to Flourish, for those of you who don't know, is a multi-year co-granting and research program at Monash University in Melbourne. Fire to Flourish was created following the 2019-20 bushfires with a mandate to explore and experiment with different ways to support community-led resilience building, including models of community co-granting, in deep partnership with 4 specific regions that were really heavily affected by the bushfires in New South Wales and Victoria. I acknowledge my colleagues from Fire to Flourish who are here and just hold up their work, the transformative work that they've been undertaking over the last few years. Recognising the unique and disproportionate impacts that major disasters have had and will continue to have on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, Fire to Flourish has prioritised a focus on Aboriginal leadership, participation, priorities and outcomes across the whole program. As part of this focus, it has invested in our program, National Indigenous Disaster Resilience, as a leading national research program seeking to understand and quantify the distinct and unique impacts that disasters have on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, whether as populations or residents or discrete communities. We then use that knowledge as a basis to create systems change within the structures, institutions and processes of Australia's emergency and disaster arrangements. So if that's me professionally, personally, the number one thing that I am is a father. So these are my little ones. I love putting photos up of my kids. I can't help it, I'm sorry, but I love them. So this is my little guy on the left. He loves our little smoking ceremonies that they do. So that's him. He was getting ready for dancing at Garuga School. He's in kindy, and you know, he runs around and gets smoked all the time. And then so his name's Darramulin. Darramulin is the son of Bhiamie, which is, you know, I guess fitting. And my little girl on the left is Baralga. So Baralga in English, it's like, well, Baralga is our word, and it's the root word of the English word Brolga. So she's our little dancing water bird. And we spend our days just cruising around on country, being on country, you know, teaching kids, and it's wonderful. It's so wonderful, and I feel incredibly privileged to be able to work at a big university in this country, but work from home and grow my kids up in their own community, on their own country, surrounded by their family, immersed in their community, and just surrounded, growing up, you know, around the ancestors and their cultural heritage. So, you know, we need to kind of seek out those opportunities to make sure we're transmitting culture, transmitting our stories into the next generation. And this is a small part of, you know, the lives that we live out at home. So if this is who I am now, where I come from is probably best thought of through my parents. So the photo of all the beautiful young Aboriginal women on the left with the big hair in the 1970s. So the lady on the left with the full face on the left, that's my mother, Bhiamie Williamson. She, at the ripe old age of 24, led the establishment of an Aboriginal Interpretations Unit at the Museum of Anthropology at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. So she left Cloncurry, moved to Brisbane, got a job there, and it was the first ever unit dedicated to the cultural interpretations and representations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and culture in a collections institute in Australia. And it was amazing. They had this group of young Murray women up there with, you know, the, you know, set against the Hollies and Roberta Flack and those kinds of things, just running around on the mean streets of Brisbane, doing their thing and having a great time. On the right-hand side, the bloke at the front of the march there at the old Parliament House, for those that can't recognise us, that's my father. He was heavily involved in the civil and land rights movements and the Black Panther movements, like radical stuff operating out of Redfern in Sydney. So that's where he lived. And yeah, so this was after they first tore down the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, they re-established it, and it was kind of seen as this big victorious moment, you know, sticking it to the then government, and that's him in that. So I'm kind of the product of this, you know, really staunch intellectual mother and a kind of quite a radical activist father. So I guess I was fated to play some role in Indigenous affairs in this country. I studied at the Australian National University and found a home in the School of Environment, specifically the School of Geography. And I found meaning in my education through cultural land management programs and specifically Aboriginal Ranger groups. This is some photos from the time, from one of the times I was up in the Euahlayi Aboriginal Land Trust. That's in the Northern Territory. It borders Queensland. It's a really big land trust. This is the Euahlayi Rangers. And these guys do extensive cultural burning. And they did cultural burning before it became in the, you know, popular vernacular. These guys have been doing it for 20 plus years. And they started it because all the communities, when they got their land back, they went back to the outstations, but the outstations were incredibly unsafe because of the overgrown, like the buffel grass in particular, that was growing out there. So they had really strong, fast-moving grass fires, and the only way to control those intrusions was to put fire back into the landscape and try to rebalance it, to insulate their outstations and make it safe for the old people who wanted to live there. So I was lucky enough to work with these guys and research with them. and spent a lot of time up there with them. It wasn't just in the Territory, though, or the Northern Territory, where I started to see and observe these kind of programs. It was also occurring in Canberra, where I lived. So I also worked with a ranger group in the ACT called the Murrumbung Yurrungmurra Rangers. So they're an Aboriginal ranger group existing within the structures of the ACT Parks and Conservation Services. And after I researched with these guys, I actually worked for ACT Parks and Conservation Services for a period, and was a member of the ranger group, and helped design the cultural burning program that's still in effect in the ACT now. But as I was working across both of these programs and other ranger programs as well, whether it was Northern Australia or Southern Australia, the radically different geographies, radically different contexts and histories of colonisation, radically different community capabilities. But what I found was pretty similar structural roots that was enabling these kind of activities to take place, and some of the same structural features and the same objectives between the different communities. So I became really interested in the underlying drivers of success that these programs were, forging ahead, doing wonderful things, like what was going on in the governance, particularly of those communities, to create the environment for this cultural, resurgence. So I became quite interested in Indigenous governance. But so I went overseas, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but the photo in the top left is me and a countrywoman of mine, Charlie Sue Frail. She's from Brewarrina, it's just down the road from Garuga. They've got the fish traps, we don't, but we beat them all the time in football. So, but Charlie Sue, she's from Bree, I'm from Garuga, but we found each other and became friends at university. And I'll digress because it's a lovely story, but her grandfather and my grandmother grew up together on Brewarrina Mission. So they were both removed there from different places in the landscape when they were kids to the mission, and they grew up there. And thinking about them, they and how they grew up and when they grew up and the conditions under which they grew up, they saw through their and remembered it through their childhood memories, the menacing face of colonisation, frontier kind of colonisation, and the cataclysm that was, colonisation, the disruption, the suppression of the culture of our peoples. Like, what a disaster to see as a child and observe that. And yet at the end of their lives, so Charlie Sue and I graduated at the same ceremony on the same day, and the university put on a little luncheon for us. She brought her grandfather from up not far from here. I brought my grandmother from Redfern. And it was funny, me and Nan were there first, and she walks in with her grandfather, this old fella called Bomber, and my Nan, who hadn't seen him for about 75 years, walks straight up to him and points at him and goes, "Bomber." And then he looks at her and goes, "Mavis." And then she paused for a moment and she's like, "I thought you were dead." And he's like, "Nah, I just moved to Kempsey." So it's like, and that was the start of our day. So it was pretty amazing, and to me it really represents progress, and we need to see that progress and we need to celebrate it as we go along. So after graduated, I went overseas, explored some opportunities overseas. So on the right with me, the big cactus, is at the University of Arizona in their Indigenous Governance program. And on the left at the bottom is my cohort at the Masters of Indigenous Governance program at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. In Canada, I would go on to do some further research, and met and had a close friendship with this wonderful human being. This is Chief Russell Myers-Ross. He was chief of the Silkwal-Te'in First Nation, of the Unesset-Te'in First Nation, which is one band within the larger Unesset-Te'in Nation. And spent a lot of time up with his community. So this are some photos of Unesset-Te'in, Stony, they call it for short. And it was wonderful because they were really interested in developing some ranger programs, or what they'd call them guardianship programs over there. And they were looking to Australia to provide that best practice example, because it's one of the things that we actually do, and I would learn it overseas. We do our ranger programs, our cultural land management programs are the envy of the world. We do them so well. We should be so proud of them, and we should continue to support them and fund them with vigour and long into the future. We don't do a lot well with Indigenous relations in this country, but with ranger programs, we are world leaders and world beaters, and the rest of the world looks to us for leadership in this sector. And so I was brought the expertise from my time doing ranger work over there to help them develop a guardianship program, which they did and they've still got. Shortly after I left though, in 2016-17, in the northern summer of 2017, British Columbia and this little community was beset by huge, huge wildfires. It came through and absolutely smashed this little community and all the little communities on the Chilcotin Plateau and right up through interior BC. It's a huge wildfire corridor that occurred up there. The community, because they had the governance capability and the authority, the tribal authority, they were not waiting for emergency services and resilience agencies to get out, to evacuate their community and to safeguard their community. They did it themselves. Not only did they do it themselves, but then they also conducted their own after-action reviews, and they actually commissioned researchers to come in to do a bit more of a thematic analysis on those events, what happened, what went right, what went wrong, how would they do things differently next time. It was a real showcase in self-determination built on the back of strong and effective community governance. This was a report that they published. It's publicly available. You can go and have a look at it. It's called The Fire Awakened Us. It's the English name, obviously, The Fire Awakened Us. So that happened in 2017. I read that report. Little did I know 2 years later the fires would take hold here and that would awaken the world. But before the fires, people forget that the fires didn't come out of nowhere. The context for the fires came after extreme drought, and before the fires, the story of that year, I'm sure many of you remember, was the Murray-Darling Basin and the fish kills and the dry riverbeds. This is a photo of the Barwon River, the main arterial of the Northern Basin. This was taken just outside of Walgett. This is my photo that I took when I went back there after I got back from Canada in 2017. Those rivers weren't just dry, they were dry long before they were beamed into the television screens of Australian homes. They were dry for years. You know, leading up to the bushfires in 2019, 100% of New South Wales was drought declared. So it wasn't just the bushfire catastrophe, it was built on the back of another catastrophe which had decimated particularly parts of Western New South Wales and transformed our landscape. I'd always, throughout my time researching, I'd come across the term solastalgia, this thing of like, you know, missing a place and whatnot. I never really understood what it felt like until I went home at the time I took this photo, because here I was in my own country and yet that country was not there. You know, this feeling, this immense grief of wanting to be in a place when you are there. You know, that longing and that sense of incompleteness is profound, it is far-reaching, it's something that we don't know enough about, but it's something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people feel immensely and intensely. Following the drought, obviously the bushfires hit. This is a photo taken by a photographer at midday at Malakuta, you know. So we all remember, I still remember how the smoke tasted. You know, we lived in Canberra still at that time, in Queanbeyan specifically, and we were getting hammered from smoke from the Talaganda National Park fire outside of Bungendore. We had the Aurora bushfire on the south of us. You had a couple of fires that lit up around Canberra Airport and threatened us. We got evacuated twice. My little guy ended up in the hospital. We evacuated down to my sister's place in southern Canberra and then to Wollongong. It was just a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. It was just apocalyptic, right? And I know that in a room of people who just remembers that as vividly as I do. Through and immediately following the fires, all of a sudden Australia found cultural burning almost overnight, you know? And it's because it was so, I feel like people were just in a sense of like stupor, like, you know, were just genuinely had no answers. The challenge was so great, things were so badly stuffed up, you know, and the processes that, I feel like there was a general recognition that the processes that created the conditions for that cataclysm were not going to be the same processes that we would find our way out of it. We needed something else. And so Australia and the world generally, in different parts of the world, in Canada and the United States as well, turning to Indigenous land management practices and particularly cultural burning. And I got asked to write some articles on cultural burning because I'd written a few and knew a bit about the sector. But there was another story unfolding at this time that people weren't recognising, that people weren't dealing with, that people weren't talking about. And so I started to write about the impacts of Aboriginal people during those events, like the social impacts. What was happening to people? How were they feeling? You know, and what were they going through? What were they experiencing? And so I started to write some papers, write some media articles. It's a photo of during the Royal Commission, International Natural Disaster Arrangements, provided testimony to that. And it occurred to me when I started to do that I was the only person apparently writing about it. I was the only person paying attention to it, drawing attention to the experiences of Aboriginal people, which I found extraordinary because when I spoke to community members, whether it be on the South Coast, whether it be throughout the Kosciuszko Range, the Alpine areas, whether it be here on the North Coast, the Central Coast, like all over the place, the story was similar and just striking. And that is how badly people were treated. So tried to capture as many of those stories as I could, and write about it, record it, you know, and it slowly but surely started to insert Aboriginal experiences in disasters into the national narrative. You might have heard even the language. Aboriginal people are disproportionately impacted by disasters. That came from the Royal Commission testimony, that exact language. So, you know, you kind of start to see where the research and the evidence base is so critical to be able to say things with authority, and then how it gets picked up and taken into mainstream Australia. When I was hearing about the stories of how badly people were treated, I started asking myself, like, how on earth could we have gotten here? And so I started to look at some of the national policies that existed that, you know, by themselves, kind of like, they all do different things and they, you know, have different purposes, speak to different audiences. So I tried to look at them. Well, I did look at them. And I looked at one, and then I looked at another, and then I looked at another, and I looked at another. And you know what I found? Nothing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Nothing. These are just 4 that I like to pick on, but there are many, many more. And it is changing, and I will get there towards the end of this presentation. But for instance, you can do like simple word searches in these documents, and it just kind of reveals itself, right? Like in the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, so, you know, this is still one of the main documents, even though it is over 10 years old now. Indigenous appears once, Aboriginal not at all. Culture talks about a culture of resilience, specifically about the culture of emergency management agencies. Cultural and economic capital. Traditional, that is traditional government policies and areas, traditional emergency management sector. So like the words are there, the meaning's not. The same in the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework. The same in the Australian Disaster Recovery Framework. The same in the Australian Emergency Management Arrangements. Beyond an acknowledgement of country, an acknowledgement of traditional owners, there is nothing, or at least there was nothing at the time of the bushfires, which is why people were treated so badly, because there was no requirements that they be treated with care, with diligence, with respect. As Aboriginal people, as traditional owners, as people intensely connected to those places and those lands. And some of the basic cultural considerations that you would find by not even just doing research, by just having a think about how do we engage with Aboriginal people. You know, none of that consideration was taken into account, and the results were disastrous. I started to think beyond this. Has it always been, or how can this be so new that there's nothing, that no one's writing about it, that there are no policies? How can it be? So I started to look into history and some of the previous, like specifically Royal Commissions, inquiries and whatnot, and still just nothing, complete erasure in all of those documents as well. I had to go back to this event, 1974 Brisbane floods, which I know affected this region as well, 50 years ago, or 48 years ago, at the time of the 2022 floods, and there it was, something really, really interesting, which indicated to me that this is not new. And it didn't come from any government, mainstream government agency or process. It actually came from an organisation called the National Aboriginal Conference, which was, at the time, in the 70s, a voice representing the interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Sound familiar? So they had these meetings, and 4 to 8 February, they had one immediately after the Brisbane floods. If you opened up, or I opened up this one specifically and started to look at some of the recommendations they made, and these were some of the first recommendations, that a fund for flood victims in Queensland and New South Wales of $10,000 for each area be established from NACC funds. They were dedicating their own money to support Aboriginal residents that were impacted by the floods. That in the view of the worsening flood situation for Aboriginal communities nationally, this NAC requests the presence on Friday at the conference of Senator Kavanagh, Mr Crean, the Treasurer, and Mr Lance Bernard, Deputy Prime Minister, to obtain humane financial alleviation of the flood hardship faced. That is the first step. This NAC requests that $30,000 of its own budgetary allocation be transferred to start off an Aboriginal Relief Fund. This stuff, these motions, they could have been written about the flood 2 years ago. They could have been written about the bushfires. When no support was being provided to Aboriginal communities, our own organisations were the ones stepping up, diverting their own core funding to support their communities when others wouldn't. And so that's kind of some of the context for, you know, where the space was at, where the research was at, where the thinking and was at the time of the 2022 floods. So we established that Aboriginal people are and will continue to be disproportionately impacted by disasters. So you had this kind of growing disaster context. You had a complete lack of voice and advocacy for our people. You had Indigenous indifference in the policies and the disaster arrangements of this country. And we just established all of these things. We started to get some evidence, and then the floods hit, and it presented a whole new case study of how these things can and did continue to happen, although differently, which I'll explain. So this is a photo. Sorry, the image isn't very clear with this, with the colour, poor choice of colour, my fault. But we started to put, me and some colleagues started to put our academic skills to use, and we started to quantify the impacts specifically of the northern rivers. And the way we quantify impacts is by LGAs, because as we know, that's how disasters are declared and how funding is provided and mobilised. Things like, you know, relief funding and relief arrangements and things like that. So we use LGA boundaries because that's what the federal government used to divert resources, even though, of course, you know, LGA boundaries and traditional owner boundaries and land council boundaries don't overlap, which is a whole other structural barrier that exists. But there were 10 LGAs up in the Northern Rivers area that were disaster declared during this specific event. So we started to do some demographic analysis using the latest census data of the population in those LGAs, and we started comparing and, you know, analysing it to understand the Indigenous demographic profile of these regions. What it exposed was a region with, you know, I guess, that socio-economically would be considered disadvantaged, but even within the context of that disadvantage, Aboriginal populations experience further, deeper disadvantage. So you see here the percentage of Indigenous people in flood-affected LGAs in the Northern Rivers was 6.6%. That's quite a lot higher than the population of New South Wales and Australia generally. But it's not just the sheer number of people, it's how those population profiles are different. The blue on the left is the demographic profile of the Indigenous population, The one on the right is the demographic profile of the non-Indigenous population in those 10 flood-affected LGAs. They are vastly, vastly different. Now, when you think about the fact that disaster relief payments in this country are still $1,000 for an adult and $400 for a kid, right? Who's going to be disadvantaged in that funding structure? You know, like look, the 4 highest age profiles in the Indigenous population in this in these LGAs is 0 to 19 years. 0 to 19 years makes up about half of all the Aboriginal people in these LGAs. And that's half of, that's half of the people that are going to receive less than half of the funding available for individuals. But not only that, you think about relief packages that goes into communities. So when we don't identify and engage with Indigenous population separately, what you get are disaster responses and resources being provided that just don't meet the needs of Aboriginal communities because they are structurally and fundamentally different. Do Indigenous people need all the things that non-Indigenous people need? Absolutely, but we need more nappies. Yeah, we need more wipes. Yeah, we need more resources to get our kids back into school because there's more of our kids in school. Right? These have far-reaching implications for response and recovery. And when I started to interview people in the Northern Rivers, I found remarkably, or perhaps unremarkably, that what people were telling me was matching up almost entirely with the data. This was a participant at Box Ridge that I interviewed. There's a couple of babies, lots of toddlers, there's a lot of kids. By looking at sort of some of the profiles of the housing profiles, you can also start to see sort of the income thresholds in different households, overcrowded dwellings. The prevalence of chronic health issues, even in the context of of a region that experiences overcrowded dwellings, that experiences more chronic health issues than the rest of Australia, Indigenous disadvantages are still more pronounced. And again, you start to see this in some of the interviews that that I was conducting. So this was a participant from Ballina and Cabbage Tree Island. There was roughly 27 homes on Cabo. Within those homes, there's heaps of residents. It could be up to 12 or 13 people, and they're all in 3 or 4 bedroom homes. And some people have large family units. They have up to 9 kids. So I would say easily over 50 kids on Cabo, possibly up to 80 sometimes, and be roughly 60 adults on Cabo, and that includes elders who have chronic health issues and stuff. Communities know this stuff about their own people, and the data supports it, and yet the response doesn't. There's also damage to cultural heritage, to people as intensely connected to the land as well. This is from a participant at Muli Muli. A lot of our cultural heritage, a lot of stuff's on the ground. There was a creek out there that is known as a place where old people would grind. There was a big grinding stone there. We couldn't find that grinding stone. So I don't know if the water has taken it or not. Went on to go and say there's been no post-floods cultural heritage assessment done. It's not just the damage to cultural heritage, it's the transformation of the landscape as well. The same participant said, now we've noticed in the last 2 months that there's an invasive weed called castor oil plant, which is highly toxic to animals and human beings. We noticed they came down through one river, the Doomaresk, which extends up into Queensland. Doomaresk goes up into central Queensland, and that plant is in central Queensland. So it's come down with the flood. I've spent years swimming in the river, fishing, just being there. I've never seen the plant until after this flood. And it's only been a matter of 2 months for it to go from a foot high to 14 foot high. There were experiences of racism that Aboriginal residents in the Northern Rivers experienced. This was from someone at Korakai Box Ridge, spoke about a young resident who was trying to help out, get things to and from the distribution centre, back to the community, stopped by police, had the meat packet taken off them, and taken back. So definitely experiences of racism. But there were also experiences of community cohesion And this was a wonderful part of the interview that I had with this person who lived at Kingscliff. The response was really a whole of community response. It didn't matter who you were. If you could and you wanted to, you helped out. We had residents who were nurses who just started treating people on the side of the road and were dropping them off. I was really impressed with how brave a lot of our community members were. It was 100% community. So it was kind of uneven, unlike the bushfires, where there was a distinct and strikingly similar Aboriginal experience. In the floods, people were telling me different things about this specific dimension as well. In some communities, they had wonderful experiences and the whole community came together. In other places, they experienced discrimination and racism. So it's kind of, it really depends on where you are, in that hyper-local context. The centrality of Indigenous leadership, the Koori Mail, the story of the Koori Mail captivated national and international media. I interviewed a young guy who came up, a young Aboriginal guy who came up from Redfern and Waterloo, came up to help out in the aftermath of the flood because he came up with the crew from the Tribal Warrior who came out and helped out the mob up there. He said he had a wonderful way of describing it. The Koori Mail was basically the head of the snake. I just love that saying. Everyone just came to hear the Koori Mail. That's the place to be. That was the hub. If you needed anything, that's where you went. And spoke about everyone just coming down. Anyone who wanted to help out, that's kind of where they ended up, especially in the immediate aftermath of the response down at the Koori Coals. There's also these so in mainstream disaster research, people talk about like these concentric circles of support being basically from the geographic area, the immediate community that's affected, the wider region that community is located within, and then kind of the state and then the national, that kind of thing. It works differently for Aboriginal communities because you've got these kin-centric circles of support. It's less geographically isolated and more culturally and familially structured, I guess. So you've got the immediate family and residents in a community, but outside of that, the next level of support is actually family that kind of lives in the major centres because they're the ones with access to resources, they're the one with the time, the availability, the want to do something. And we see them advocating really strongly, really quickly and mobilising big, mobilising relief payments, mobilising packages, mobilising support and mobilising, like advocating, getting into the media, getting into their local networks and things. So yeah, you see these kind of kin-centric circles of support. That's less geographically specific and more to do with kind of the way families are structured. And also, unintended finding in the research was how participants felt that talking about their experiences promoted a sense of healing for them. But obviously it's not sort of, you need certain skills and capabilities and the right people to go in trauma-informed ways to talk with people who have been through these events. So this person who participated, and even when I was interviewing this person, they said, that they were really nervous, was really telling they were really nervous. This was my longest interview. And this is the person most hesitant to engage in the research process. We sat down and spoke for like an hour and 45 minutes. And she, at the end of it, I asked her and she said it was just the most wonderful thing and she'd never actually had an opportunity to talk about it and to be supported to explore what had happened to her. So some of the lessons learned. There are multiple overlapping and confusing governing arrangements. Unique demographic profile of the Indigenous population, overcrowded and intergenerational housing. There is always, in these events, damage to country and cultural heritage. In this specific one, there were uneven experiences of racism. So it certainly wasn't a widespread phenomenon like it was in the bushfires. It was very specific. Some of the cultural capitals, the centrality of Indigenous leadership, these kin-centric circles of support which come together and mobilise to respond to disasters, and also post-disaster research as a pathway to promote healing. But I think one of the major findings from the research, from multiple research projects, and it seems to be bleedingly obvious to me at least, is that within Aboriginal peoples and communities there exists a culture of resilience. I know resilience is a buzzword. I was just in a meeting with NEMA the other day and they're like, oh, resilience, everyone's talking about it. And I'm like, well, if everyone in the government's talking about it, like, shit, you know? like, we need a new word. But yeah, there's nothing like government to lobotomise concepts from, you know, language. And so anyway, but it is clear that, you know, Aboriginal communities, there is this kind of, this fabric, this constitution, this deeply embedded constitution of just pressing on and coming together and supporting one another. And I think that's something to be acknowledged and to be celebrated. We do see changing context. I held up those other policies before and spoke about how there were no mentions. This is the New South Wales State Disaster Mitigation Plan, released, a couple of weeks ago. You can have a look in there. It's a vast improvement, vast improvement. I think just generally it's a vast improvement on how they talk about resilience, how they talk about disasters and response and recovery generally. In Victoria, Emergency Recovery Victoria have developed a strategy for Aboriginal community-led recoveries focused specifically on the needs of Aboriginal communities in Victoria and how their needs are both the same and different to mainstream Victorian populations. So we are starting to see some change in practice, some change in policies, some change in the, you know, at least in the thinking and the conceptualising of disaster resilience in this country. But gosh, it would have been nice if it was just like that in the first place. So yeah, I guess that comes to our program. Look, our program, it's kind of, we are a research program. We are interested in asking questions, collecting evidence, analysing data. We do all of those things. But, you know, please don't think that that's all we do. You know, NIDA represents, I guess, Indigenous leadership in the academy and in the sector, but it also represents Indigenous ambition to be at the forefront of response and adaptation to a changing climate. We seek to both observe larger changes in resilience mindset and practice and be an active agent in creating that change. Above all, NIDA's really, I guess, a symbol of it's no longer good enough to forget us, and we won't be forgotten, we won't be disregarded in the disaster and emergency arrangements of this country. So please follow us. If you're interested in being involved, if there's any Aboriginal community members out there, you want to be involved in this research, please send us an email, come and talk to us while we're here. Follow us, follow the journey, and really looking forward to, you know, working with you all, creating change, observing change, and being the change. Euahlayi, thank you.
Well, that was some yarn, wasn't it? That was pretty powerful. Thank you. In Bundjalung, the word for thank you is Bugulbay. So I'm going to say to Bhiamie on behalf of all of us, Bugulbay. You've given us a lot to think about.